Hello, 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 it's your good friend Hooper here to talk about some nice cringe. C.S. Lewis. That was a joke, don't worry about it. Oh, we all love funny Lion Man. No, today we're here to talk about, technically yes, Lewis. We're here to talk about an argument known as Lewis's Trilemma. Now, Lewis's Trilemma is an argument that C.S. Lewis, writer of the Chronicles of Narnia, several other excellent works of fiction and philosophy, and a lay Christian apologist, articulated in a work of his known as Mere Christianity. In his formulation, the argument is only presented over a paragraph, and I very much doubt he intended it to be taken quite as seriously as it's later been made by certain religious apologists. But the thrust of the position is that we can either accept Jesus as the Lord, God, as a liar who pretended to be the Lord, or a lunatic who thought he was the Lord but wasn't. So you'll sometimes hear it phrased as Jesus was Lord, liar, or lunatic. As much as I love Lewis, this may take the cake for the single worst apologetics argument I have ever heard. It drives me nuts every time I hear it. Not because I think it's wrong. I know that sounds a little weird to say. Like, there's been a lot of arguments about, maybe there's some fourth or fifth or even sixth position here. Do we need to accept the premises, blah, blah, blah. I'm actually happy to grant the premises. Just for the sake of argument, we're happy to grant the premises. And likewise, my purpose in this video was not actually to defend any contrary opinion to the idea that Jesus is Lord. This isn't an apologetics channel, and I don't care if you think he was or not. No, there's two reasons I really hate that argument, and we'll get into both of them now. The first is it's intensely misleading, in the literal sense that it's distracting from a path you should actually be going down, because it attempts to produce a rational argument from what's ultimately a question of textual exegesis. And so, let me hold up a sec. So I guess to elaborate on that point, the argument takes the Gospels as a whole, and then asks us to say what we think about Jesus based off them. Now, the skeptical reader will notice there's several operative assumptions behind that premise. First is we need to look at the Gospels as a whole and not say specific parts of the Gospels. Second, so wholes versus parts. Maybe we only want to accept some parts of the Gospels, maybe we want to accept another. And then there's a whole bunch of other questions about the accuracy, not simply physical, but also metaphysical. A large part of the gospel involves miracle claims of a various... Jesus heals the sick, calls fish down out of the sky, and if you're not especially disposed to grant miracles in the abstract, then this argument is a priori rather unconvincing. A third... Apologies, I should really get into the habit of recording these by chunks, then not uploading them one at a time, but smooshing them together into a cohesive whole after the fact, but every time I do that, it sounds terrible. You have no idea how many times I've recorded this video. No idea. This is 2 straight days... 4 minutes of footage? But no, basically, the question being glossed over here is entirely hermeneutical. And that's not an arbitrary point in the sense of, is the argument right or not, because the problems we have approaching the question of was Jesus the Lord, the liar, or a lunatic are really questions of understanding hermeneut. In Greek. Right. How do we interpret historical narratives? How do we understand the claims that occur in them, not just in a Christian context, but in any context, like Buddhist monks who turn into pure rainbows. That happens a lot. Taoists flying, Jewish snake taming. There's a whole bunch of miracle claims of various sorts that appear throughout religious literature and require a consistent and considered interpretation if we want to approach these texts properly. And then the third aspect is simply, how do we approach these texts? Because the assumption being made here, the initial assumption, is the charitable way to sort of approach these works historically and evaluate the claim in them. But there are all sorts of other people who might have alternative charitable takes on this. Claims such as Jesus was an ascended master or Jesus was a Taoist immortal may not be present in the text if we want to read them in terms of to use a Jewish exegetical point, in terms of their plain meaning, which is a little different from their literal meaning, but yeah. But still, for the people who make those sorts of claims, Jesus was the reincarnation of Lao Ji in the West. Yes, that's been made. Actually, a long time ago. That's a 1,400-year-old argument that I just handed you. They think they're approaching the text charitably. And then their argument is going to be, because they can in fact defend that argument, is yes, it might not be reflected literally in the Gospels, but the Gospels are not in fact Jesus' records of himself, but his disciples' records of Jesus. Which is to say that we're dealing with what the disciples thought they were looking at rather than what actually happened. The third hermeneutical question that I tripped over earlier. And hermeneutical questions, they're partially textual questions, but they're also existential questions about how we approach other people. And that really is the main reason I can't stand this argument. I said there were two reasons, and the second one is it's just an exceptionally false understanding of what it means to do philosophy or to argue with people. Because let's go all the way back to the beginning of this video. Do you remember I observed that people have presented all sorts of alternative hypotheses to this, and contemporary defenses of Lewis's trilemma often start by trying to dismiss those hypotheses. Jesus was a rabbi, Jesus was a great sage, but not a god. Jesus was a prophet. And the glossed over question is, why do people make these arguments in the first place? Because most of the people who go out and say, oh, well, Jesus was a rabbi, aren't doing it because they think Jesus is a great rabbi. Like, how many people have seen Jesus the rabbi cited in Jewish texts? None. The reason they make that claim is, what are their alternatives? Right? The Christian is going for the Lord. That's why he's making the argument. But if you're not a Christian and you're not willing to accept the claim that Jesus is Lord, and there's some guy in front of you that's demanding an answer, are you going to tell him to his face that you think Jesus was nuts? Are you going to tell him that you think Jesus was a duplicitous liar? Those are both defensible arguments. You can, in fact, mount exegetical arguments for Jesus having been deeply insane or intensely immoral. I'm not saying I believe them, but you can make them. They would be what Paul Ricoeur calls the hermeneutics of suspicion. And would Christians like those arguments? No, they're blasphemy. So people default to solutions that they may not actually like because they don't want to blaspheme the Christian God to their face. For the same reason that most people don't think Muhammad was the last prophet of Allah, but they don't go around drawing Muhammad's face on every wall they see. Because it would be rude. And when people do that, it's because they want to be rude. Much in the same way that when people go out and say, oh, well, Jesus definitely had a dissociative identity disorder. Just pick a random example off the top of my head. If a contemporarily controversial one. Right? They're saying that because they want to be very rude to Christians. That isn't a theoretical remark. There are, in fact, arguments that Jesus exhibited cult leader-like behavior in academic journals, or that Jesus was prone to hallucinations. They've been made for centuries now, in fact. But most people prefer not to bring those arguments up because they're super offensive, and they don't want to offend the person they're talking to. And yet the Christian who's coming in with this argument here, or I should say Christian apologist, because obviously the average Christian on the street is probably not going to launch that argument at you if you go, hey, friend, local Christian guy. But the Christian apologist is coming in and he's trying to get them to one option and trying to offend. It's like, well, if you don't want to accept this one, you have to defend one of these other two. And they don't accept his option. But do they want to go to the other two? No. And so the outcome is something that could have been a candid conversation now becomes a game of cat and mouse played via rules of dubious logic, to be frank. Very dubious logic. And so why is this relevant to apologetics, you ask? Because what's the goal? If you're a stalwart Christian, a fervent Christian, and as I said, I have no interest in trying to convince you not to be a Christian if you happen to be a Christian. What do you want to do? Are you interested purely in getting people to say they confess Christ? Or are you interested in getting them to confess their hearts to Christ? If you're saying it's the latter, right? If you're a good person, you want people to honestly confess themselves to Christ. And an honest confession requires honesty on both parts. And it's these logic games that totally undermine the possibility of apologetics or just interfaith discussion as a dialogue of the heart that really drive me nuts. But yeah, this was an absolute mess of a video. I'll probably revisit it again later, but you have to get this stuff out sooner or later. And like I said, probably 12 or 13 hours of me just recording half this video and then deleting it. And we'll be touching on some aspects of this again in future, so don't worry even if I don't revisit this exact argument, we'll be discussing all of the hermeneutical points in future videos, because we're going to do a lot of folklore. Alright, it was an absolute pleasure. You guys have a great day.